Professor Coleman is an authority on the scientific method, statistical analysis, and logic. Please welcome to Hope at Night, Dr. Major Coleman. Dr. Coleman,
hey.
We're glad you're back.
Hey, it's good to be back. It really is.
Since the last time you were on this show, there has been lots of discussion, lots of talking, lots of videos, millions of views, and lots of controversy as well.
Oh, yes.
Before we get into any of that, we want to hear a little bit more of your background. How did you go from flunking out of high school to becoming a law professor with multiple doctoral degrees?
Uh-oh, Anil, I was afraid you were going to ask me that because I know the answer to many things, but I don't know the answer to that. Okay, I'm going to be honest with you. I do not have the foggiest idea. All I remember is that one evening I was on my face in a deserted graveyard praying to God not to die and that I wanted to have an education. And the next thing I knew, really, and this is where I leave off, I said the next thing I remember, really, I was sitting at my desk at Stanford University with, at that time, 2 doctoral degrees and teaching a class in political science and jurisprudence. I would like to take credit for it. Well, I studied hard. I did not. I did not.
And that's something it definitely you give glory to God
Amen.
for.
That's all I can say. That's all I can say.
Now, you shared with us in that previous episode that you had done lectures on creationism versus evolution at a public campus. What was that all about, and what was the response that took place there?
Well, because I got tired of having my students attacked by the Evolutionary Studies program on campus, and we had a fine Evolutionary Studies program. I taught courses in the Evolutionary Studies program. I support the teaching of evolution on campus. Not as the only theory of origins, but I certainly support it. And I got tired of my colleagues attacking my students and in my department because of their belief in the biblical story of creation. So I decided that I was going to put together my own program, which we did. And once I put it together, I realized why I had never done it before. It must have taken me 2 years just to put the program together. And we did all-day seminars, much to the chagrin of the Evolutionary Studies program. I asked them to come forward, my colleagues to come forward and present to students their theories about origins. I even offered them $20,000 if they would sign an agreement to come forward and debate me in writing, in public, on which theory of origins the science supports, creation science or evolution. And no one showed up. I went home with $20,000 in my pocket, and I was ticked, really. I was ticked because I had been trying, I and my own mentor, Dr. Walter Brown, had been trying for 30 years to engage evolutionists in debate without success, and still without success.
But you're a law professor. What are you doing talking about science? Is there science to the idea of creationism?
Yes, there is. So, yes, I am a law professor. But 2 of my doctoral degrees have the term science in them. I have a PhD in political science. I have a doctor of juridical science. And we use science in this term not just to mean hard science or natural science, chemistry, biology, physics. Science, this is what science is. Science is the use of observation, record keeping, controlled analysis of the empirical world. That means things you can see, touch, and feel, the empirical world, which is falsifiable by others. In science, we use hypotheses and theories. We never come to firm conclusions. It's always growing and moving. And by that definition, that is, I am a scientist, I'm a social scientist, and I'm also a legal scientist. Observation, things that you can touch and feel. When you understand really what science is, and that all of us are scientists, because we all observe and see and make decisions about things, all right, science is for everyone. Understanding this more deeply, we have to understand that when we're talking about origins, no one saw the earth created. No one saw the sun created. No one saw the universe created. Therefore, when we're talking about origins, we are not talking about science directly. We're talking about something closely related to it that we call scientific inference. That is, because we cannot see what happened there, no one observed it, we have to use things that are connected to it, that we believe are connected to it, and evaluate those things. That is science. And in that sense, I am a scientist and proud of it.
Phenomenal. You know, when we had you on last time,
yes,
there were clips that were made. They went all over, shared on everything from Instagram to Facebook to YouTube to TikTok. Millions of people have watched these clips. Thousands of people have commented, and we're not exaggerating on this when I say this. I mean, just last week, someone sent me a clip of this that was done months ago, 1.8 million views.
Wow.
On just that one clip. And that's just one of several of these clips that went viral. Why do you think so many people are interested in the topic of creation versus evolution?
Because I'm a social scientist, I'm very reluctant to answer things off the cuff without either survey evidence. This is what I think. I think that because without understanding where you come from, you really don't know where you're going. And many people want to know where they're going. And I think it spurs an intense interest on knowing where you actually come from. We have to be honest, I think, in understanding the religious dimensions of origins. And I think that's why on my campus many years ago when I started, I got such strong objections, because origins and what you believe about origins is really a religious belief. And so when people saw me showing that the biblical story of creation is supported by, I used to say at that time, most of the science. I don't say that anymore. Now I say that all of the science supports the biblical story of creation. And I think people are curious. They've never heard it before. And I'm saying, you've got questions, we've got the answers.
The topics of origin is much more powerful and much more psychological than we truly understand.
Yes.
Last time you were here, you discussed the postulates of creationism and the postulates of evolution. Could you recap what those were?
Sure, I'm glad to do that. When we look at these two ideas, creation science and evolution, both of them are based on four, we say, foundations or postulates. Evolution has four postulates upon which it rests, okay? Creation science also has four postulates that it rests on. And you have to begin to, before you really get into the origin theory itself, you have to understand those postulates. So evolution is based on four postulates. The first postulate is that life comes from non-life. One of the biggest questions that I get from viewers is Major, is this really true? Does evolution really demand that we really talk about origins? The three founders of evolutionary theory, most people only know Charles Darwin, but he was not the only one, and he was not the first. Herbert Spencer, a British philosopher, was the first one to propound the theory of evolution. And then Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace together wrote a scientific paper on the idea. All three of them made statements that origins is not just about how life changes, but also about how it began. So that's the first postulate, that life comes from non-life.
And that's, by the way, if you don't mind me interrupting here, and that's very important for you to share, because a lot of people think the discussion of evolution is a separate discussion from how life actually started, the building blocks. But what you're saying is, look, when they do bring up the discussion of evolution, it's a unifying theory. They connect both of those two topics.
I say argue with Charles Darwin, Alfred Russel Wallace, and Herbert Spencer. And I show that all three of them, in their theory of evolution, all of them propounded that evolution also explained how life began. And Charles Darwin is most famous for that, for saying that all you need for life is a little pond somewhere and a few salts and acids. He's making a claim about not only about how life changes, but also about how it began. So that's our first postulate, and we have to know and understand that. The second postulate is that all life, complex life, came from single-celled life. And of course, the science shows that is not true. While we do have single-celled life forms, okay? We have no two-celled life forms. We don't have three-cell life forms. We don't have four-cell life forms. We don't even have five-cell life forms. That is, there's nothing in between. We jump from single-cell life forms, most of which are bacteria, to complex life forms like worms, all right? Amoeba, and myself, right? I'm a complex, multi-celled life forms. There's nothing to fill in that gap, so science supports that.
Okay, now I got to interrupt you some more here.
All right, go ahead.
You know, as somebody who, had these clips on the platform, I had a lot of people saying, wait a minute, Dr. Coleman, aren't there such a thing as two-celled life forms out there? Three-celled life forms? Those don't exist at all?
Actually, no. Now, we have, for instance, yeast and what we call blue-green algae. Actually, blue-green algae is not an algae, it's a bacteria, okay? And while they live in clumps, all right, just like we live in groups, they are single-celled life forms. The same applies to yeast. And there were some interesting experiments done about 15 years ago about yeast. evolutionary scientists wanted to see how fast yeast evolved and how fast yeast cells could adapt to salty water. So they put the yeast in salty water, and they were surprised, and of course yeast multiplies very fast, that's why we use it to make bread, okay? They were surprised to find that in just 50 or 100 generations of yeast, which is just a few hours, okay, that it had already adapted to the salty water. And what surprised them was that it was too fast. That is, evolution is supposed to be a long process, but these yeast adapted to the salty water so fast, it showed clearly that the genes were already present in the yeast. All right, so actually those comments about blue-green algae, which is a bacteria, and yeast actually support what I said. While these are single-celled life forms, just as I said, we have a big jump to the next group of life forms, which are multi-celled, complex life forms. And I've asked many people, I'm saying, so give me a 3-celled life form, and I don't mean yeast or bacteria that live in groups, all right? You also have to remember that we have parasites as single-celled life forms, or even complex life forms, which demand a host to continue the life to support, which again supports creation science. A parasite cannot live by itself. How did it get its start? You had to have complex life there to begin with. So that was our second postulate. Then we go to our third evolutionary postulate, that time and chance are what drive evolution forward. And this is an interesting one. That is, given enough time, anything is possible. But of course, what is it that allows evolution to violate the laws of probability that apply to everything else? Everything else is governed by probability, but evolution somehow magically is not. And I tell people, I'm saying, the chances of you leaving here this evening and going outside and getting struck by lightning are 1 in a million. Scientifically call that 10 to the 6th power, 1 in a million. The chances of you or I winning the lottery is 1 in a billion, 10 to the 9th. And that's probably why I'm sitting here and not out of my sailboat, okay? 1 to the 9th. Do you know what the probability of one simple 100-unit protein is? The probability of that. It's the same as putting together a 100-letter sentence, same as, that makes sense, not random letters, 100-letter sentence, the same as that probability. It is 10 to the 116. Now, most people can't comprehend a number like that, but just to give you an idea, I already told you that winning the lottery, getting struck by lightning is 10 to the 6th. Winning the lottery is 10 to the 9th. If we took all the atoms in the entire visible universe, by the way, a dot on a period on your paper, 1 trillion atoms can fit on that. That's how small an atom is. Do you know how many atoms there are in the entire visible universe? 10 to the 70. That's all. The chance of a 100-unit protein assembling itself is 10 to the 116. It is mathematically impossible. Michael Denton, the biologist from Australia, he said in his 1986 book, Evolution, A Theory in Crisis, he said, that comes as close as possible in my mind to proving that evolution is false. It is impossible. Time and chance are evolution's enemy, not their friend. And then the fourth postulate is that minor genetic variation within species explains the macro differences that evolution claims. That is, fish turned into cows because we have cows that are different colors, or dogs and cats that are different colors and different sizes. Gregor Mendel, in the 1850s and 60s, a priest, showed using peas that, and we call him the father of modern genetics, he showed that all these differences that we see are caused by genes, and that there are no new genes which created. All the genes were there in the original pair. Every major postulate for evolution has been scientifically proven to be false. Creation science also has 4 postulates. Number 1, where there's a design, there must be a designer. Where there's a super design, there must be a super designer. Where there's a supreme design, we say there must be a supreme designer. DNA, RNA are built on codes and languages. In every place that we look, whenever you see a code, which is a way of translating from one language into another, you must have intelligent life, and that's what we see. Postulate number 2 for creation science, that the basic kinds and species that were originally created are what we see today. That is, there are many different types of dogs. German shepherds are dogs. Wolves are dogs. Dingoes are dogs. Wild dogs are dogs. Foxes are dogs, all right? But they're all dogs. They're not cats. And of course, in many cases, they can interbreed. There are strict limits to our ability to interbreed between species. That's the biblical story of creation, and that is what we see today. That's what we observe. That's science. Okay? Basic creation postulate number 3. And that is that about 2,500 years ago, there was a worldwide flood. All right? That buried all the continents. And you say, well, Major, do you have any evidence for that? And I say, yes. What are the oldest living things on the earth? They're not turtles, Galapagos turtles.
How many years ago was the flood?
2,500 BC.
2,500 BC, okay.
So you're talking, give it, and of course this all happened on my birthday, 2,500 BC. Give or take 4,000 years or so, all right? The oldest living thing that we have on the earth are trees. Bristletone pine trees in California, and the redwoods and sequoias. And how old are they? 4,000 years old for both of those species of trees, which are not connected to one another. Okay, that's very strange because there are no petrified stands underneath them. As far as we know, sequoias don't die unless you chop one down or you burn it. All right, there's nothing that kills them. In fact, if the wood were commercially usable, they probably wouldn't be there today at all. All right, so that's what we see when we look at creation, the 4 creation postulates. The science supports them.
Dr. Coleman, I can't help but notice these rocks here. I thought maybe the construction crew left them here. Now, what are these rocks all about?
These rocks are visual evidence for our 4th creation postulate, and that is that the Earth, the solar system, are young, measured in thousands of years, not millions or billions of years. What you see here is pink granite, which I have always thought is the most beautiful. There's black and white granite, there's black granite. I love pink granite, and it's just gorgeous. And here we also see what we call rhyolite. It is actually melted granite that is hardened again. Earth's crust is made out of granite. It's the base rock for the Earth's crust. Originally, the crust was probably about 60 miles thick of solid granite. Today, depending upon where on the Earth, it can be 10 or 15 miles thick. And if you look closely at the granite, you all see all these little sparkly little things in there. That's quartz. Many people don't know that if you ever do a cookout in your backyard and you have one of these lighters and you pull a switch and goes pop and it lights a flame and you can light your grill. It's called what we call the piezoelectric effect. Piezo means pressure. When you push down on quartz, it actually makes a spark. That's one of the reasons why we know where radiometric dating comes from, because when Noah's flood took place, this granite, although it's very hard and very heavy, on an Earth-sized scale, it's about as thick as a sheet of paper, and it can actually move and flutter like a flag. When it does that, it actually creates what it's called bremsstrahlung radiation. I call it, to simplify, I call it lightning, because it's like a lightning bolt in rock. Okay, and that's what created the heavy elements that we see. When we compare these two, granite to rhyolite, it shows us, because the Earth's crust is not layered, granite is not layered, it's all these minerals mixed together, it shows us that Earth's crust was never molten, never molten. Another scientific evidence that you can see, touch, and feel that the biblical story of creation is true.
Now, I got to bring this up because, taking high school biology, which is the the limit of my science classes, oftentimes we're told carbon dating, we're told the fossil record, all those things refute this idea that life here is young and we've been here for millions of years. What would you say to someone like that?
When you understand the assumptions that go behind carbon-14 dating, which measures the age, it purports to measure the age of things that are alive. What it actually measures is the ratio of carbon-14, which is radioactive, to carbon-13, which is not. That's what it actually measures. And we assume that measures age. Radiometric dating, there are many different types of radiometric dating. The most common is potassium-argon. Uranium-lead is the second kind. We're measuring the ratio of what we call the mother element, which is radioactive, to the daughter element, which it degrades to. Potassium argon, we're talking about potassium, and it degrades to argon. When we're talking about uranium, it degrades to lead over millions of years. If you know where the mother element came from, then maybe it might answer the question for you. But let's just talk simply about carbon-14. Carbon-14 only measures the ratio of things that are alive. Because carbon-14 is radioactive and it's in the air, the current ratio is about 1 carbon-14 atom to 1 trillion carbon-13 atoms. We breathe it in. We're breathing it in right now. We breathe in carbon-14. Trees, anything that's alive, breathes it in. When you die, your carbon clock starts ticking because you have stopped taking in carbon-14. And we assume then, if we can measure the ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-13, that we know how long it was that ago that you died. There are several assumptions there. We assume that the ratio of carbon-14 to 13 was the same in the past that it is today. We also assume that the ratio never changed. We've shown scientifically that both those assumptions are false. But there's another thing we have to remember that's really important. Carbon-14 is one of the strongest evidences that we have for creation, and a recent creation. Why is that? Because carbon-14 has a half-life of only 6,000 years. That is, in 6,000 years, half of the carbon-14 is gone. Another 6,000 years, half of it is gone, half of it is gone. Until you get to about 50,000 years, there should be no carbon-14 left in anything that is over 50,000 years old. Well, guess what? The oldest elements on Earth, gas, oil, coal, all have carbon-14 in them. That means that they're the oldest things. There should be none there to show that they're billions of years old. It means that nothing on this planet is older than 50,000 years. They are young. It supports creation.
Well, I got one more question for you, though. When I open up that biology book, it shows the evolutionary scale that's there. And you look in the fossil record, isn't it full of a lot of bones and fossils that support that evolutionary model?
What I do for my students on campus, I say, rather than talk about which fossils are human and which fossils are ape, why don't we look at all of the supposed ape-human fossils that we've collected? And they say, all of them? I say, yeah, all of them. Only 25. That is all of them. That's all we have. All of them put together would fit on your desk. And so we examine each one, and I give them a picture of an ape. And most of the time, what we're looking for is the jawbone, because that's where we can see the biggest difference between apes and humans. And you have to understand the difference between juvenile ape jawbones and adults, okay? And after I've shown them every single fossil and they can compare it, I'm saying they can decide for themselves which ones are human and which ones are ape. There's Neanderthal, which for many years we claimed was ape man. Now scientists admit Neanderthal was fully human in every aspect. And of course you can see it from comparing the jawbones. Examine the evidence for yourself and make up your own mind. Real scientists are not afraid of the science and the evidence.
That's right. It's like truth is like a diamond. The more you scratch at it, the more brilliant it becomes. We don't have to be afraid of questions. Only afraid of those that stop the questioning.
That's right.
Welcome back. We've had some great conversations with Major Coleman and Clifford Goldstein on the topic of evolution and creation. But now it's time to hear from our live audience. What questions do you have for our guest today? Right over there.
What about ancient civilizations that predate the creation timeline?
I get asked that question a lot, and the answer is actually very simple. There are none. So we have to say, how are you going to date that ancient civilization? Human writing is the only accurate, absolutely accurate evidence that we have to date anything. That is, somebody wrote it down and they wrote their date, which we can connect to our dates. Many people are surprised that we have no datable human writing that predates 2500 BC.
Wow.
None. None. Not a few. Zero. Absolutely zero. Once you leave human writing behind, now you're going to carbon-14 and pottery records and all the assumptions that go into that. And of course, we've already talked about this, carbon-14 dating, which dates things that are alive, bones or plants, all right, which would include papyrus. They are not older than the biblical record.
And 2500 BC is roughly the estimate of
Noah's flood.
Noah's flood, which wiped out civilizations that existed. Okay, amazing. Any other questions? Right over there.
If you believe in evolution, wouldn't that mean that you believe in death before sin? And doesn't that contradict the Christian worldview?
Yeah, it absolutely in every way does. I mean, when you read the biblical creation account, there's just death is the enemy. You know, in the beginning, there's no death at all. There's only the warning of death if they ate from the tree. But again, if you read the whole gospel story, and particularly Romans 5, Paul 6 times has Adam bringing death, Jesus bringing life. Adam brings death, Jesus 6 times. Paul's whole theology of the cross, the whole plan of salvation, everything is built upon the idea of one man, Adam, bringing death, Jesus, sometimes call Jesus the second Adam, undoing what the first Adam did. So again, I think you're right. They're not logical. There's no possible way evolution can be true and the Bible be true.
So if we do accept this idea, hypothetically, God used death and millions of years to bring about life, what does it do to the gospel?
Well, it ruins it. It ruins it. I mean, unless you think Paul was a dupe and Paul was wrong, and there are people who say that. Paul just misunderstood. The gospel is predicated on the idea that one man brought death and sin into the world, and Jesus came to ultimately undo that. But here, Jesus comes, lives, suffers. God uses billions of years of violence, suffering, and death to create human beings, and then Jesus comes to eradicate sin, suffering, and death, the very means God used to create us to begin with. Again, I find more honesty among atheists than I find among theistic evolutionists. The true atheist evolutionists know how ludicrous it is to try to harmonize the Bible.
You can mix those ideas until you try to explain it. That makes logical sense. All right? That's when I said the problem is you can believe them, you just can't do them. That is, you cannot explain it in some logical fashion. That's the problem.
Excellent. Any other questions? Right over there.
If evolution is not real, then why do apes have opposable thumbs?
If my Toyota truck didn't evolve from a Maserati, why do they both have four wheels? You see what I'm saying? People say, well, there's a similar genetic code with apes and humans and so on, therefore we must have evolved from them. Well, we had a similar creator, and he created them in similar ways, and so on. So to me, that's a perfect example of assuming you're interpreting the opposable thumb through the presupposition of evolution when I just say God created them that way. That's all.
Let me back you up. That is, you're using homology. That is the science of similar designs and structures to say, I assume that came from evolution. You could just as well say, I assume it came from a similar designer. That is, it's what in science we call that bias. You're bringing your bias to interpret the evidence. Take away your bias, and that's not there. You could ask the question without the evolutionary or the creation science bias, and you could say, we have similar structures among species. What does it mean? Now that's an honest question.
That's a fair question
that's
right
a fair
there,
question.
because it's removing that
right,
presupposition there.
Right.
Interesting. Any other questions? Right over there.
I wanted to know, why did God create this universe?
We believe in a triune God that's loves. There's love within the Trinity. And that love, I believe God wanted to share with created beings, okay? Because we don't believe that the triune God was created. It's, again, how to understand it. It always existed. And yet it existed in love. And He, the Lord, wanted to create beings that could share in that love as well.
God didn't create us so we could love Him. He created us so He could love us. Another way of looking at it.
Interesting. And I think this is part of the mystery of eternity, is to understand and ask the Creator Himself.
Yes.
Why am I here? I heard somebody once put it this way. They said that the two most important days of your life is the day you're born and the day you discover why.
Wow.
And maybe the second one will be ultimately answered in eternity.
Amen.
Any other questions? Right over there.
If in the future evolution is proved to be the truth, as a man of science, could you live with that?
I would love to see that day, and I've offered them $20,000 to come forward and show it to me. I would love nothing better than that. That is, I'm not only a scientist, I'm also a law professor. That is, it's an adversarial system. That is, that's what I live with. That is, when I go to court, the judge doesn't say, you know what, you both made such great arguments, you both win. Isn't that wonderful? No. There are winners and there are losers. Come forward, let me see your evidence, let me see your challenge. That is, as we say, either put up or change your origin theory.
Amazing.
What I would answer from science, but if I thought evolution for a moment were true, proven however you could, I would flat out reject my religion. I would basically curse God, and just tell him, burn me in hell, destroy me when it's done. I wouldn't want to serve a God like that. So that's what I think the issues are.
Right, and I think the question can be turned around on its head, and that is this. If evidence for Christianity was true, would an atheist, a skeptic, agnostic be willing to become a Christian? And the reason why this question is so important is because this question actually has been posed to atheists, and their answer oftentimes were absolutely not, which shows this is not a scientific issue.
It's a heart thing.
There's a heart issue also that is part of this.
Yeah.
Dr. Coleman, Cliff, I feel like we could keep talking for days and barely scratch the surface
Yes.
of this topic.